Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. My guest today has brought to Paducah the Mountaintop Removal Road Show. His name is Dave Cooper. He's from Lexington. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on the show, Barry.
What is the Mountaintop Removal Road Show?
Well, Barry, about 10 years ago, I heard a presentation from a fellow in West Virginia named Larry Gibson. And Larry came to Lexington and told us about his mountain in West Virginia. He said, when I was a boy, I could stand on my mountain and look up, and all the other mountains around me were taller than my mountain. And he moved away to Cleveland, his family did, as he was growing up. When he came back to West Virginia to retire, he found out that all the mountains around his mountain, which is called Caford Mountain, are now lower than his mountain because of this thing he called mountaintop removal. And he said, they're blowing up the mountains all around me, and I'm trying to save my land, and the coal companies are trying to get my land, and they've shot up my cabin, and they've threatened me because I won't sell my land to the coal companies, and please help me save my mountain. And I heard this presentation, and I thought, that sounds pretty interesting. I'd like to see it. And you know, people tend to exaggerate a little bit when they're telling their stories, and so I figured it couldn't possibly be as bad as what Larry was saying. I mean, they're not actually blowing up mountains. You know, there might be a little damage, but I wanted to go to Larry's mountain and see it for myself. So I drove to West Virginia, and at this time I was working as a mechanical engineer in industry. I designed machinery.
And that was in Lexington?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I actually worked at the plant that makes the Post-it notes, the little sticky notes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Have one of those right here, by the way. Yeah.
And I was very content and happy in my job until I saw Larry Gibson's mountain in West Virginia. And it's just a little bit to the east of Charleston. Drove down I-64 and got off the highway and was driving up Larry's Hollow. And I noticed that the area of West Virginia where he lives has a lot of economic challenges. It's a very poor area, not very many people. And Larry had told me that at one time there was 100,000 people living in his hollow, but all I saw was empty buildings and so on. So it was very strange. I got up to the top of his mountain and I stood there in Larry's family cemetery with all his ancestors going back 200 years. This land has been in his family for a long time. And I looked out on the most horrible devastation that I've ever seen in my life. I never could have imagined that something could be as horrible and terrible as this mountaintop removal. These are wonderful, biologically diverse mountains covered in hardwood forests, pure mountain streams that provide millions of people with their drinking water on the Ohio River, and we're turning them into an enormous rubble pile. They actually blast the tops off of these mountains. They'll take 600 to 800 feet off the top of the mountain. They scrape the coal out, and then the top of the mountain, which is in the way of getting at the seam of coal, they have to dispose of it somewhere. So they found the cheapest thing to do is just to put the top of the mountain into the valleys between the mountains, and they fill the whole valley up with this material they call valley fill. And as I stood there in Larry's family cemetery, looking out over this incredible, horrible devastation, I guess you'd say, Barry, it was really a life-changing experience. And I was very happy in my job making Post-it notes, but I felt like I needed to do something about this terrible thing that I was looking at. And I really wanted to help Larry save his land. About a year after that, I ended up quitting my job at the 3M company making the Post-it notes. And I've been working on this issue of mountaintop removal full-time as a volunteer ever since then. And I felt like the best way that I could help Larry save his land is to go on the road and explain to people what mountaintop removal is, because so many people don't know that coal generates over half of America's electricity from burning coal. In Kentucky, it's over 90%. It's not coming from a hydroelectric dam on the Ohio River. It's not coming from a nuclear power plant. Our electricity in Kentucky comes from burning coal. And more, the coal companies have found that the most profitable, fastest way to get the coal out of the mountains is not with the underground mining, which requires a lot of workers, a lot of miners, a lot of union miners. It's to do this mountaintop removal. And they have these huge machines, on these mountaintop removal sites. Giant bulldozers and an enormous crane called a drag line. And they take the dirt and move it around. And a mountaintop removal mine may only have 10 to 20 people working on the job site. So it's not a big employer, as opposed to underground mining where you have hundreds of people working underground. And the more that I learned about mountaintop removal, the more I became convinced that it's something that must end. It's not helping Kentucky. In fact, I believe that it's moving Kentucky backwards. And I just feel so strongly about this that I've been going on the road for the last 6 years now, speaking to college students and libraries and Rotary clubs about mountaintop removal.
Mm-hmm. You touched on, well, the argument in favor of this is economics. It's economics on the one hand versus environmental on the other. Let me read you a quote from an article in the Appalachian News Express in Pikeville, and this was remarks made by Lieutenant Governor Dan Mongiardo, who everyone knows is running for the Senate next year, hopes to be the Democrats' Senate nominee. And this is a quote from this newspaper. "A lot of people look at mountaintop removal as a negative, but I see it as a positive. We need to stop apologizing for coal. We don't want to defend mountaintop removal, but I want us to promote mountaintop removal because we need flat land. We cannot have economic expansion without places to do things, and part of mountaintop removal is for places like hospitals, airports, and different types of merchants." Your comments on that?
Well, it's a very interesting quote from Lieutenant Governor Mongiardo. I think that if he would drive just a few miles to the east of his hometown of Hazard, he would see thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land that has been flattened by mountaintop removal. The site has been known by various different names. These coal companies change names all the time, but generally known as the Starfire Mine. It's along the Hal Rogers Parkway in between Hazard and Hindman, which is the next county to the east. You've got a stretch of land roughly 10 to 15 miles where if you're driving from Hazard to Hindman on the left, the north side of the Hal Rogers Parkway, virtually the entire landscape has been flattened by mountaintop removal. There's thousands and thousands of acres just on that one job site right now that have been flattened that are waiting for development, but there's no development. Why aren't these sites being developed? Why is Lieutenant Governor Mongiardo saying we need more flat land when we already have tens of thousands of acres of land that have already been flattened? Well, the problem is when they're finished doing the mountaintop removal, what you have is a flat or rolling landscape, but there's no infrastructure there. There's no water, no electric, no sewer, no roads. It's just a flat piece of barren land. And Walmart is not going to build one of their stores out in a remote area. I mean, a factory is not going to come in, General Motors or Toyota is not going to come in and build a site on, build a factory on a mountaintop removal site because there are so many other things that you need for economic development besides flat land. If flat land was the only thing that we needed to generate wealth and prosperity, then Kansas would be the economic hub of the United States. But it's not. You have to have the workforce properly trained, you have to have the infrastructure and the roads and so on in order to build this economy. Now in Hazard, they have built some sites on flattened land from strip mining, old strip mining, and they've had tremendous problems with subsidence. When you move enormous amounts of earth around, you have to compact the land in order to be able to build on it. There is a hotel in Hazard, which I'm sure that Lieutenant Governor Mongiardo knows all about. The back side of the hotel had to be torn down because it was sinking. They can't use this part of the hotel anymore. There have been numerous other sites around Hazard that have had subsidence problems. One of the big economic development projects in Martin County, Kentucky, is called the Big Sandy Federal Penitentiary, and it was built on one of these valley fills where they dumped the top of the mountain into a fill. They built this prison on top of the mountain called the Big Sandy Federal Penitentiary. It cost the taxpayers $40 million just to try and stabilize all this fill material so that they could build this prison with, it has enormous concrete guard towers and so on. It's a very massive building. As they started construction, they started having problems with more subsidence, and they had to spend even more money on it. It turned out to be the most expensive federal prison ever built because of these subsidence problems. And this is on the border between Floyd County and Martin County. I mean, it was, from an engineering standpoint, this project was a debacle. There have been sites there's been schools that have been built on mountaintop removal mines in McDowell County, West Virginia, that have had problems with subsidence. The Lowe's building in Hazard, the Lowe's home improvement store in Hazard had some subsidence problems as well. It's not an ideal surface to build on. In fact, it can be a very troublesome to build on these sites. So this argument that we need more flat land, the past has not shown that to be true. There are tens of thousands of acres already developed that are already flattened, that are waiting for development, and no one's coming in to build on them. So I say that Lieutenant Governor Monjardo is really blowing some smoke here with this flat land argument.
He goes on, another quote, "Something else we've been working on for more remote areas is adventure tourism. We can put people on horseback, mountain bikes, foot, and four-wheelers in eastern Kentucky, which, as you and I know, is one of the most beautiful areas in this country. There's no place prettier than going to the top of the hills and looking out across eastern Kentucky."
Definitely, and eastern Kentucky is a very beautiful place. I personally spend a lot of time in the coal fields of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. The mountains, where they haven't been blown up, are extraordinarily beautiful. We should be marketing the beauty of those mountains. And if we want an example of that, we can look at the eastern Tennessee, the area around the Smoky Mountains National Park, and certainly western North Carolina. Now, in western North Carolina, they don't have coal, so the mountains are all, for the most part, pristine. What they have found in the areas around Asheville, North Carolina, and Boone, North Carolina, anyone who's been there recently will attest to this, is millionaires are coming in and building second homes and retirement homes. It's an incredibly beautiful area. And if you drive through Boone or Asheville at night, you'll see very, very opulent, expensive homes up on top of the mountains, looking out over these beautiful streams and mountains and the changing of the leaves and so on. The beauty of the mountains is what's drawing people to move to western North Carolina and East Tennessee. And of course the area around Gatlinburg, of course they've overdeveloped it to some point, but there's hundreds of thousands of people that visit the Smoky Mountains every year. They have developed that area for tourism, not by blowing up and destroying the mountains, their most important natural resource, the beauty of the area. They're marketing it, they're selling it to the public to create a place where people want to live. Meanwhile, in southern West Virginia, which is probably ground zero for mountaintop removal, and parts of eastern Kentucky, counties are actually dropping in population. I spent some time in Harlan County, Kentucky, which is a very historic area with a long history of coal mining. At one time, there were over 100,000 people living in the town of Harlan. Now it's about 20,000 or less than 20,000. So the population is dropping dramatically in these coal areas. Now, what are we doing wrong in Kentucky and West Virginia, where these coalfield counties are depopulating, and the areas in North Carolina and East Tennessee are growing like crazy? It should be obvious that the road that we're going down with extraction and destruction of the mountains is not the route to economic prosperity. It's the route to poverty and depopulation. We've got to stop blowing up these mountains and start looking at how we can develop and market the beauty of these areas. Now, one of the things that Lieutenant Governor Monjardo has been promoting is this adventure tourism, and that is horseback riding and mountain biking and hiking. And really what it is four-wheelers. It's an ATV recreation, which is a very growing, booming activity in eastern Kentucky. In Harlan County, there's a community called Everts. They have taken a section of Black Mountain, which is one of the tallest, is the tallest mountain in Kentucky, and they have opened up a lot of four-wheeler trails. And every weekend, hundreds or maybe even thousands of people come to Harlan County to go four-wheeling on the mountains. And it has provided a lot of economic development in the town of Harlan. There's motels and bed and breakfasts and restaurants and things like that. In West Virginia, it's been very successful. They have a trail system called the Hatfield-McCoy Trail, and in southern West Virginia, and they promote the history of the area as well. But these trails are being done to create some economic development in these southern West Virginia coalfield counties, and it is working. They're riding on old strip mine sites, and people are coming in from all over the country to go ride on these strip mine sites. So I have mixed feelings about it, but if the four-wheelers have to ride somewhere, I'd rather have them riding on top of an old strip mine where they're not going to do any more damage that's already been done to the mountain, than having them ride in, say, a creek, which is going on a lot in eastern Kentucky, and we need to stop that. We need to get the four-wheelers out of the creek. So, so I have mixed feelings about the adventure tourism plan. Certainly mountain biking could be promoted more in eastern Kentucky, hiking. There's a wonderful mountain in eastern Kentucky called Pine Mountain, and it's about 70 miles long. It's a ridge that goes all the way from Pineville to the Breaks Park. There's a nice hiking trail on top of the mountain, and there's a trail called the Little Shepherd Trail, which is a very scenic, beautiful little winding road on top of this mountain. That's the kind of thing that we need to be promoting in eastern Kentucky, is start promoting the beauty of the area, and let's stop the destruction.
But again, going back to, I think, what Mongiardo's point is he says it will bring in lots and lots of jobs. That's what he says, that this is...
That the adventure tourism...
Well, no, mountaintop removal, the whole thing. And again, it go back to what I said earlier, it's an economic development thing. And again, in times of economic difficulties that we're in now, you can see how this would have a certain appeal to it.
Sure.
So how do you counteract that? If you go, and by the way, do you speak up in eastern Kentucky in these counties on this?
When they let me.
When they let you, I was going to say.
This is a very volatile issue.
It's a very volatile issue.
And there's been actually been some incidents this summer.
With you?
Not with me personally, but we do some protests and things like that against mountaintop removal. And there's in West Virginia right now, it is incredibly tense right now between the environmentalists and the mining people. But the issue of jobs is something that it's complicated, and at first glance it's very easy to say, oh, this Dave Cooper, he's an environmentalist. He cares more about fish and birds and trees than he does about people. And he doesn't care whether, if he stops mountaintop removal, that a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs and get laid off in eastern Kentucky. Here's the facts. Mountaintop removal uses gigantic machines to move the dirt around. They're not these people working on these jobs are not really coal miners as much as they are heavy equipment operators. They're the same kind of type work that you could find on any road construction site. They're bulldozer operators and so on, pushing the dirt around. The machines are doing all the work, not the people. On a typical mountaintop removal site, you may only have 15 or 20 people working on site, as opposed to an underground mine, which has hundreds of people working underground. So when a coal company is able to get the coal with mountaintop removal instead of underground mining, they're actually able to do it with far fewer number of people. So it's not creating jobs in eastern Kentucky. I would argue that mountaintop removal is actually putting people out of work. You remember I was talking about the 100,000 people that used to work in Harlan County. Those were underground miners. Today, 20,000 people in Harlan County, because mountaintop removal doesn't employ people. Now, the people that make the machinery, the Caterpillar Corporation and these other big heavy equipment operators, they're all doing very, very well with selling equipment to mountaintop removal operations. But let's face it, they're located in Batavia, Illinois, at the Caterpillar Corporation. That's not helping eastern Kentucky It's not creating jobs in eastern Kentucky. It's putting people out of work. So the jobs argument, in my view, is completely fallacious. It is not. Mountaintop removal does not create jobs. It puts people out of work. And if we're going to talk about jobs in eastern Kentucky, we have to face that fact, is mountaintop removal is not going to bring prosperity to eastern Kentucky. It will never happen.
Given the fact that you have, as you say, statistics and numbers on your side, why is it such a hard sell up there to the folks in eastern Kentucky?
Well, there's a long history of coal mining in eastern Kentucky, and I think most of the people that live in eastern Kentucky feel that coal is supporting the local economy. They've certainly had that drummed into their heads repeatedly for the last 100 years, is that coal mining is what we know how to do here in eastern Kentucky. We saw a similar thing a decade ago with the tobacco. We thought that we could never pass no smoking ordinances in Kentucky because it would hurt the tobacco farmers, and it required a very big change in our way of thinking here in Kentucky. But now in the communities that have passed the no smoking ordinances, they'll never go back to allowing smoking in the public buildings again. People have seen the light on that issue, and we have to go through this same sort of process with the coal mining as well. I think that people in eastern Kentucky feel like the environmentalists are here to take their jobs. They don't understand the history of the area. They don't understand that coal mining is what keeps the lights on and so on. And one of the tactics that's been used in West Virginia quite a bit is to portray the environmentalists as being against coal. I'm not against coal. I'm against mountaintop removal mining. I want to stop mountaintop removal, go back to underground mining, which would create a lot more jobs in the coal fields. And as we transition away from coal towards renewables like wind and solar, this underground mining will be a bridge. Other parts of this country are moving ahead very rapidly with wind turbine development. You can see them along the interstate highways all over the country now. There's more people that are employed by the wind turbine industry now than by the coal industry. That's a fact. And that is, if we want to talk about economic development, let's look at the mountains in eastern Kentucky and start thinking about putting wind turbines on top of these mountains instead of blowing them up.
So that's the big propellers, look like big airplane propellers?
Correct. And you have to install them, you have to maintain them. It's an enormous expense to get these built, but the landowners, if you have your mountain leased for a wind turbine or a ranch in North Dakota, you get a rent from the people that put up the wind turbines. So, which is about $2,000 per year. So if you had 10 wind turbines on your land in eastern Kentucky, you'd be collecting $20,000 in rent every year. That's a good deal for people in eastern Kentucky. We can do solar. It is possible in Kentucky to have solar power. And the problem is that we have leaders in our state, such as Lieutenant Governor Monjardo, who are promoting the past, coal and mountaintop removal, and not looking at these enormous opportunities that we have now with renewables, wind and solar. That's the direction of the future. And I feel like our leaders in the state need to be looking at why somebody like T. Boone Pickens, an oil man from Texas, very famous from 10 or 20 years ago, is now completely sold on the possibilities of the wind turbine industry, and he's thrown his weight behind promoting the wind turbine industry. He's a very wealthy man because he's smart, and he knows that wind is where it's at, and he's not backing coal. So that's what I would like the leaders of our state to be looking at, the future, not dragging us back towards this past.
How old is the technology of mountaintop removal? How long have they been doing this?
In 1972, there was a terrible accident in West Virginia. A dam broke at a coal mine, and a wall of water.
I think I remember that.
It was on Buffalo Creek in West Virginia. It killed 125 people living in the hollow below the mine. And after that, there was a recognition throughout the country that we need to do something about some regulations on strip mining and coal mining. In 1977, in the Carter administration, they passed a law called the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act, known by its acronym SMCRA or SMCRA. That law passed in 1977 recognized mountaintop removal. So it was going on as far as during the 70s. But mountaintop removal was envisioned to be an exception, a rare practice that was only used very, very sporadically. Once the coal companies figured out how to do it, they got the technology and they got the machines, they figured out how to move all this dirt around, and they realized how much money they could make with this mountaintop removal. It's grown more and more and more and more. And now you see in West Virginia, the whole southern part of the state, I believe the number that is widely quoted now is about 500,000 acres of land has been flattened already. By the year 2012, they expect that an area about 2,100 square miles, approximately the size of the state of Delaware, will be impacted by mountaintop removal. And the number of streams that are being buried by this mountaintop removal is a huge concern. We live in a society today where we prize mountain spring water more than, well, if you look at the price, we pay 3 times as much for spring water as we do for gasoline. It's for a little bottle like this is $1.25, right? For a pint. And if you figure that out, it's about $10 a gallon.
In the time we have left, we're down to 1 minute.
Sure.
It always goes by fast. What would you like to see done? Legislation passed to stop this?
Yeah, we need to ban the mountaintop removal. The way to do that is to pass a law saying you can't bury you cannot bury our mountain streams with this mining rubble. There's a bill in Congress. It's called the Clean Water Protection Act. I believe that Congressman Whitfield has expressed some interest in supporting this legislation. In Central Kentucky, Congressman Chandler has signed on to support this legislation, and Congressman Yarmouth have signed on to support this legislation. We need to get this bill passed so that the coal companies will stop burying the streams that provide millions of Kentuckians with their drinking water from the Ohio River. That's what we need to do.
Before we go, I would like to invite anyone from the coal industry, from Lieutenant Governor Mangiardo's campaign, to come and talk and present the other side if they like to do that. We always like to do both sides. Meanwhile, thank you, Dave Cooper, for coming. I'm Barry Craig, and we will see you next time.